Chapter 1. The River of Whispers. The West was connected by a single iron nerve. A thin, dark wire stretched taut over sun-scorched plains through the jagged teeth of unforgiving mountains and across the unmarked soil of forgotten graves. It hummed with the secret lifeblood of a nation, an invisible current carrying promises of love and threats of ruin with the same cold, metallic indifference. It was a river of whispers flowing unseen above the dust and blood of the frontier, a spectral artery pulsing with the frantic coded heartbeat of progress and despair. And at the heart of a small forgotten town called Echo Creek, a place cupped in the dusty palm of the vast prairie, sat the man who listened to the river. His name was Samuel Finch. And one night, as the world outside his window held its breath under a blanket of stars, he heard a whisper that carried the distinct, chilling weight of a hanging rope. Samuel was not a man of action. He was a man of patterns, of rhythms, of the quiet and meticulous order he imposed upon the chaos of the world. The sharp staccato clicks of the telegraph key were the metronome of his life, a constant familiar percussion against the crushing silence of the plains. His small office, tucked between the general store and the assayer's shuttered shack, was his monastery. It smelled of ozone old paper and the bitter tang of acidic ink, a scent he had come to associate with solitude and purpose. He was a ghost in the machine, a disembodied consciousness that translated lightning into language. His office was a confessional where sins and secrets were not spoken in hushed tones, but tapped out in a frantic, desperate code that travelled hundreds of miles in the blink of an eye. He was privy to it all. He knew of the cattle baron in the north, his coded messages detailing land grabs that were little more than theft on a grand scale. He knew of the lonely rancher's wife, her weekly poetic messages to a man in San Francisco who was not her husband. He knew of the desperate gambler in the saloon, his pleas for funds growing more panicked with each passing week. He heard the birth announcements and the death notices, the market prices for grain, and the urgent summons for a doctor. He heard the entire unvarnished opera of human existence, and his purpose, his sacred and solemn duty, was to forget. He was a conduit, a vessel, a pane of clean glass, through which the light of information passed without distortion. This was the first and most important lesson his father Elias Finch had taught him. Elias, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weariness of other people's urgencies, had sat Samuel down in this very chair some 15 years prior. He had placed Samuel's small hand on the cool brass of the key. "Samuel," he had said, his voice as dry as the dust on the windowsill, "we are not the story. We are the paper it is written on. We don't make the weather, we only report it. A storm, a flood, a fire. It is not your business. You listen, you write, you send, and then you empty your mind. The wire demands neutrality. Without it, you are not a telegraphist. You are a town gossip with a very loud voice, and there is nothing more dangerous than that." For 10 years since his father's passing, Samuel had honoured that creed with a monk-like devotion. He was Echo Creek's most reliable secret keeper, precisely because he kept none of them. The messages passed through his fingers and out of his mind, leaving no residue, no emotional trace. The townspeople trusted him with their most intimate affairs because they knew he was in essence empty. He was a function, a utility, as invisible and reliable as the sunrise. He was Samuel Finch, the telegraph man, and that was the beginning and the end of his story. Chapter 2. The King of Echo Creek. The undisputed, though uncrowned king of Echo Creek and the vast sun-bleached plain surrounding it was a cattle baron named Silas King Corrigan. Corrigan was a man who seemed forged from the very earth he sought to conquer, a thick, formidable figure with a grizzled beard, hands like weathered slabs of oak, and eyes the colour of a stormy sky. His ranch, the sprawling Triple C, was less a home and more a fortress, a kingdom unto itself that commanded the horizon in every direction. He ruled not with a badge or a title, but with miles of newly patented barbed wire and the unwavering, fearful loyalty of men who were paid well to ask no questions. Corrigan's ambition was a prairie fire, a relentless force that consumed everything it touched. He believed in manifest destiny, not as a national ideal, but as a personal mandate. The land was there to be taken, and he was the man with the will to take it. He saw weakness in men in law, in nature, as a vacuum to be filled by his own strength. And in his eyes there was no greater weakness than sentiment. His fire was now aimed squarely at the McAllister family. The McAllisters were homesteaders, a stubborn clan of Scottish descent, with a small verdant patch of land nestled in a valley just north of town. They possessed the one thing Corrigan's sprawling empire lacked, the one thing his money and men could not conjure from the dry earth, the rights to the deep water spring that fed their valley, a source of life that ran cool and clear, even in the driest of summers. The McAllister Spring was a legend, an oasis in a world of dust. They were the last holdouts. For 2 years Corrigan had laid siege to them. He had made generous offers that were politely refused. He had made threats delivered by his grim-faced foreman Jed that were quietly ignored. He had cut off their access to the eastern range with his barbed wire, forcing their small herd into poorer grazing land. Yet the McAllisters endured. They were a small, defiant stone in the path of his expanding empire, and Corrigan's patience had finally irrevocably run out. Samuel knew all of this, of course. He had transmitted Corrigan's initial, almost civil offers. He had transcribed the curt legalistic warnings from Corrigan's lawyer in the capital. And he had felt the shift in tone over the past months, the messages growing shorter, colder, stripped of all pretense. The polite language of acquisition had devolved into the blunt grammar of intimidation. He knew the McAllisters too. Not well, but as one knows the familiar, comforting landmarks of their own town. He knew Angus McAllister, the patriarch, a tall, quiet man with kind eyes and a handshake as firm and honest as his character. Angus would come in once a month to send a message to his sister in Colorado, always filling the paper with news of the crops, the health of his wife Elspeth, and the progress of his son. He knew Elspeth, a woman of quiet strength who sold her peerless apple pies at the annual town fair. And he knew their son Thomas, a boy of about 12, with a shock of red hair and a constellation of freckles across his nose. Thomas was endlessly fascinated by the telegraph office. He would sometimes press his face to the glass, his eyes wide with wonder, trying to decipher the magical clicking that connected their small, isolated world to the great unknown expanse beyond. Samuel, in a rare break from his studied neutrality, had once shown the boy how the key worked, letting him tap out his own name in Morse code. The look of pure, unadulterated joy on the boy's face was a memory that for some reason had refused to be forgotten. Chapter 3. The Message on a Moonless Night. On a moonless Tuesday night, as a storm gathered in the distant mountains, its silent flickering lightning illuminating the peaks like divine thoughts. The whisper came down the wire. The air in the office was thick and still the prelude to a summer tempest. Samuel was working late, catching up on the day's ledger. The telegraph, which had been silent for hours, suddenly sprang to life with a sharp, insistent chatter. He moved to the desk, his body a well-oiled machine of habit. He pulled a fresh slip of paper, dipped his pen in the inkwell, and let his fingers rest lightly on the key to acknowledge the signal. The message was coming from Rock Falls, the next town over, a place known for its transient population and rough saloons. It was a coded message, using the private numerical cipher that Corrigan employed for his most sensitive business. Samuel's mind shifted gears effortlessly, his fingers transcribing the dots and dashes into numbers, his brain translating the numbers into words as he went. It was a skill as natural to him as breathing. The message was for Jed Corrigan's foreman. Meet at Sunrise Canyon, Thursday dawn. McAllister, Cattle Drive. Prevent arrival at market. No witnesses. The words materialized on the paper under his pen. The final two. No witnesses. Samuel's fingers froze over the key. The air in the room suddenly felt thin, hard to breathe. The familiar clicking from the sounder continued for a moment, the sending operator waiting for his final confirmation. But Samuel did not hear it. All he could hear was the screaming silence that erupted in his mind. This was different. This was a line crossed, a boundary shattered. This was not a business transaction. This was not a threat. This was a death sentence tapped out in the simple, elegant, horrifying language of murder. Prevent arrival at market. At a euphemism as thin as ice on a spring morning. And the final brutal clarification, no witnesses. That phrase echoed in the silent office. It was an execution order. It meant not just Angus McAllister and the two farmhands who rode with him. It meant the boy. It meant Thomas with his red hair and his curious eyes, who always rode with his father on the annual cattle drive to town. It was his rite of passage. For the first time in a decade of professional detachment, the message did not pass through him. It struck him. It lodged in his chest like a shard of ice, sending a cold, sickening dread through his entire body. He stared at the flimsy piece of paper in his hand. It was no longer a message. It was a loaded gun, and his hand was the one wrapped around the trigger. He eventually found the strength to tap out the confirmation signal, his touch clumsy and uncertain. The wire fell silent. The river of whispers had delivered its venom and moved on, but Samuel remained paralyzed in the suffocating silence of his office, the damning words glowing on the page under the lamplight. Chapter 4. The Weight of Silence. He delivered the note as protocol demanded. He sealed it in a plain envelope and walked the half-mile to the saloon where Jed and Corrigan's other men often spent their evenings. The saloon was loud with boisterous laughter and the tinny clang of an out-of-tune piano. Samuel handed the envelope to the bartender, a man whose eyes missed nothing. "For Jed," Samuel said, his voice a dry croak he barely recognized. He turned and left without another word, his face a mask of practiced neutrality that felt brittle, ready to crack. Walking back through the dark, quiet street, the town's silence seemed to accuse him. Every shadow seemed to mock his invisibility. His father's words returned to him, but now they sounded different. A storm is not your business. Was this a storm, or was this a snake slithering into a child's nursery? A storm was an act of God impartial and immense. This was an act of a man, a cold, calculated decision born of greed. His neutrality, once a shield of professionalism, now felt like a shroud of cowardice. That night, sleep offered no escape. He lay in his small room behind the office, staring at the ceiling. Every creak of the floorboards in the old building sounded like a footstep approaching his door. Every gust of the rising wind against the window pane sounded like a name being whispered on the breeze. Thomas. He saw the face of Angus McAllister, a man of quiet dignity who had always treated him with a simple human respect. He saw the face of his son, whose innocent laughter he sometimes heard as he passed the one-room schoolhouse. He saw them riding into Sunrise Canyon, a narrow, treacherous pass of red rock, and long shadows, a perfect place for an ambush. He saw the flash of rifle fire from the canyon rim. He saw the confusion, the terror, the end. And he saw himself sitting in his office, washing his hands of it all, another neutral, silent observer. By dawn, he was a wreck. He made coffee, but could not drink it. The town slowly came to life outside his window, the familiar routines a painful counterpoint to the chaos raging within him. To do nothing was safe. It was rational. It was the creed he had lived by his entire life. Corrigan's reach was long, and his memory for betrayal was absolute. If a warning reached the McAllisters, there was only one person in Echo Creek who could have sent it. His life wouldn't be worth a counterfeit dollar. They would find him, and his death would be recorded as a tragic accident. But to do nothing was to become an accomplice. It was to let his silence be the ink that signed their death warrant. It was to stand by while a good man and his son were slaughtered for a patch of grass and a trickle of water. The weight of it was physical, a pressure in his chest that made each breath a conscious effort. He considered his options, his mind a frantic maze of dead ends. He could go to the sheriff. But Sheriff Brody was a good man worn down to a nub by the town's apathy and Corrigan's power. Brody had a wife and 2 young daughters. He had a single deputy and a jailhouse with a leaking roof. He was a symbol of the law, not a wielder of it. A confrontation with Corrigan's men would be suicide, and Brody knew it. Samuel had seen proof of this just a month before. A young farmer new to the area had accused Corrigan's men of rustling a few of his cattle. Sheriff Brody had ridden out to the Triple C to investigate. He had returned that evening, his face pale, his hat dusty, and had spoken to no one. The next day, the young farmer sold his land to Corrigan for a pittance and left town on the morning stagecoach, his eyes fixed on the floor. Brody had been warned off, and the message was clear to the entire town. The law in Echo Creek stopped where Corrigan's land began. Going to the sheriff would be a futile gesture that would endanger them both. He could try to warn the McAllisters himself, ride out to their homestead under the cover of darkness. But he was a poor horseman, a man of the office, not the open range. Corrigan's men were everywhere. He would be seen. The result would be the same. He was trapped by his knowledge, trapped by his fear, trapped by a lifetime of practiced inaction. He felt like one of the moths that battered itself against the glass of his lamp at night, drawn to a light that would ultimately destroy it. Chapter 5. The Ghost in the Machine. He spent all of Wednesday in a state of torment. He went through the motions of his job, his hands steady while his soul trembled. Every click of the telegraph from an outside station made him jump, half expecting a message of discovery, of exposure. The hours ticked by, each one a step closer to the dawn of Thursday, a step closer to the ambush in Sunrise Canyon. As evening approached, a profound sense of despair washed over him. He had failed. Fear had won. He would do nothing. He would live, and the McAllisters would die, and he would have to carry the knowledge of it, a secret tenant, in the hollow rooms of his conscience for the rest of his life. He sat at his desk, the lamp casting his long, weary shadow on the wall. His gaze fell upon the telegraph key. It sat there, inert, gleaming under the light, an object of passivity, a tool for listening. His father's voice echoed in his memory. We only report the weather. But what if the weather could be changed? What if the report itself could become the storm? An idea born not of courage but of pure, desperate cunning began to form in the depths of his mind. It was a terrifying, audacious thought. He couldn't warn the McAllisters directly. That was a fool's path to the grave. He couldn't confront Corrigan's men. But Corrigan, for all his power, had a weakness. He was a king, and kings, no matter how absolute, are wary of greater powers. He was a wolf, but even a wolf fears the lion. And in the vast territory of the West, the only lion, the federal government. US Marshals. He couldn't stop the ambushers, but perhaps he could stop the man who sent them. He wouldn't shout a warning. He would plant a seed of doubt. He would create a ghost, a phantom on the wire, a lie so potent it might just pass for truth. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, not with fear, but with a strange, wild surge of adrenaline. It was a gamble of the highest order. The slightest mistake, a slip in the coding, the wrong rhythm in his sending, an uncharacteristic turn of phrase, and he would be exposed. But the alternative was to do nothing, to let his soul die, even if his body lived on. With hands that trembled only slightly, he sat down at his desk. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of ozone and finality. He didn't send a message to the McAllisters. He didn't send one to the sheriff. He sent one for the sheriff, a message he knew would be intercepted. He chose a station far to the east, in a territorial capital known to be a hub for federal lawmen. He would route his message through 2 switching stations, muddying its origin. He carefully composed the text in his mind, mimicking the official, clipped and slightly arrogant style of a government dispatch. He had transcribed hundreds of them. He knew their voice. He took another deep breath, and his fingers, his traitorous, neutral fingers, began to dance upon the key. They moved not with the frantic energy of fear, but with the cold, precise focus of a surgeon making a life or death incision. The message was addressed to Sheriff Brody of Echo Creek. To Sheriff Brody, Echo Creek, from Office of U.S. Marshal Laramie. Be advised. Deputy Marshals Reed and Carter en route to your jurisdiction. ETA Friday evening. Mandate to investigate ongoing land disputes and multiple reports of homesteader intimidation. Maintain peace and preserve all relevant records. Expect full cooperation. End. He sent it. The clicks echoed in the small room, each one a stone cast into a silent pond. He signed off his own station code, a final, damning piece of evidence if anyone traced it back. The lie was out. A ghost on the wire. A phantom posse of lawmen riding toward a town they didn't know existed on an investigation that would never happen. He leaned back in his chair, his shirt soaked through with sweat. His entire body hummed with the residual energy of the transmission. He had done it. He had acted. He had thrown his stone into the river. Now all he could do was wait and pray he hadn't just signed his own death warrant alongside theirs. Chapter 6. The Unsent Storm. The following day, Wednesday, passed in a torturous, drawn-out agony of silence. Every time the bell above his office door jingled, Samuel's heart leaped into his throat. But it was only Mrs. Gable from the general store sending a message to her sister or a young ranch hand inquiring about a delivery. He performed his duties with a mechanical calm, a placid surface above a raging sea of anxiety. His ear was trained on the telegraph sounder, listening for the clicks that might signal his discovery, or for the blessed silence that might signal his success. The hours crawled by. The sun reached its zenith, then began its slow descent toward the western horizon. The deadline was approaching. The ambush was set for Thursday at dawn. If he didn't hear anything by tonight, it meant his plan had failed. The thought was a cold knot in his stomach. Then, in the late afternoon, as the shadows began to lengthen across the dusty street, the sounder sprang to life. It was a message from the Triple C Ranch from Corrigan's foreman Jed, addressed to the same men at the outstation in Rock Falls. Samuel's hands shook as he reached for a fresh slip of paper. He forced himself to breathe, to focus, to transcribe. The message was once again brutally short. New orders. Canyon plan postponed indefinitely. Return to ranch. Await instructions. Samuel read the words once, then twice. A wave of relief so powerful it left him dizzy washed over him. He felt his knees weaken, and he had to grip the edge of the desk to steady himself. It had worked. The ghost had done its work. The fear of federal law, even a phantom of it, was stronger than Corrigan's immediate greed. The king had blinked. He had called off his dogs. The storm he had manufactured had dissipated the real one gathering in Sunrise Canyon. On Thursday morning, the day the massacre was to have taken place, Samuel stood at his office window, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand. Just after 9 o'clock, he saw them. The McAllister family, blissfully, beautifully unaware of the fate they had so narrowly avoided, rode their small herd through the center of town. Angus led the way, sitting tall in his saddle. 2 farmhands flanked the cattle, and in the rear, keeping the stragglers in line, was Thomas, his red hair like a small flame under the bright morning sun. As they passed the telegraph office, young Thomas turned and saw Samuel in the window. He grinned a wide, gap-toothed expression of pure boyhood and waved enthusiastically. For the first time in his adult life, Samuel Finch did not simply nod or look away. He raised his hand slowly, deliberately, and waved back. It was a small, simple gesture, an exchange of acknowledgements between a man and a boy. But for Samuel, it felt like a revolution. It felt like breathing after being held underwater. Chapter 7. The King's Visit. The phantom marshals, of course, never arrived. Friday evening came and went. The town, which had been buzzing with rumour, slowly settled back into its usual rhythm. But something had shifted. A seed of doubt had been planted in Corrigan's kingdom. The king was not as absolute as he appeared. On Saturday evening, as Samuel was preparing to close his office, the bell above the door chimed. The sound was heavy final. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the deep crimson of the sunset, was King Corrigan himself. He filled the frame, a mountain of a man, his presence seeming to suck the very air from the small room. He stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind him. He didn't remove his hat. His eyes, those chips of flint, roamed the office before settling on Samuel. They were not angry. They were worse. They were cold, analytical searching. "Finch," Corrigan said. His voice was not the loud boom he used on his men, but a low, dangerous rumble. "Mr. Corrigan." Samuel replied, his heart a steady, cold drum. He did not let his gaze falter. Corrigan walked slowly toward the desk, his spurs making a soft, menacing jingle on the floorboards. He stopped on the other side, placing his large, scarred hands flat on the polished wood. He leaned forward slightly, invading Samuel's space. There was talk of marshals coming to town. Corrigan said, his eyes locked on Samuel's. U.S. Marshals caused a bit of a stir. Seems they never showed up. Funny thing, Samuel forced himself to remain perfectly still. "I only know what comes down the wire, Mr. Corrigan. Official dispatch from Laramie, addressed to the sheriff. It's all in the public log as required by law. He had, of course, created a false entry in his paper logbook, a perfect forgery." Corrigan stared at him for a long, unnerving moment. It was a look of profound predatory stillness. He was a wolf, sniffing the air, sensing that something had changed in his forest, that a scent was out of place, but unable to name it. "You're a careful man, Finch," Corrigan said slowly. "My foreman tells me you're the best on this line. Never makes a mistake. Always neutral." He let the word hang in the air between them. "I value that. A man who knows his place is a valuable asset." He straightened up, and for a moment Samuel thought he was going to leave. But Corrigan stayed put. "The McAllister Springway," he said, the change of subject as sharp as a slap. "It's a fine source of water. It would be a shame if something were to happen to it. A rock slide, perhaps. Accidents happen. The land is treacherous." It was a threat, clear and cold. But it was also a test. He was watching Samuel's reaction, looking for a flicker of fear, of recognition, of guilt. And in that moment, Samuel Finch understood. His old life was over. The safety of neutrality was gone forever. He had stepped into the story, and he could never step out again. He met the cattle baron's gaze, and the man who had been a ghost his entire life found his voice. "The wire reports all sorts of things, Mr. Corrigan." Samuel said, his own voice quiet but laced with a new unfamiliar steel. "It reports on rock slides and accidents. It also reports on federal geological surveys, and sometimes it carries messages to U.S. Marshals asking them to investigate suspicious accidents. The wire has a long memory." He had laid his final card on the table. The silence that followed was absolute. Corrigan's eyes narrowed. He saw it then. He saw the man who had been invisible had suddenly cast a shadow. He didn't know how, he didn't know why, but he knew this quiet, unassuming man in front of him was no longer a pane of glass. He was a wall. After what felt like an eternity, Corrigan gave a single curt nod. It was not a gesture of agreement or defeat, but of acknowledgement. He had received the message. He turned without another word and walked out of the office, the bell chiming his departure. Samuel Finch stood alone in the gathering darkness, the scent of Corrigan's cigar smoke lingering in the air. He looked at the telegraph key on his desk, no longer just a piece of brass and wood. It was an instrument of will. He had learned the ultimate secret of the wire, that while the iron nerve itself was indifferent to the messages it carried, the man at the key did not have to be. He was no longer just the man who listened to the river of whispers. He was the one who could, if he dared, change its course. And in the vast, lonely silence of the American West, a quiet man's conscience had just become the most dangerous weapon of all.